Okay, today we're going to start talking about the revolutions of industrialization, time period from 1750 to 1900. This portrait here, to what we would see now, is a portrait of dirt, smoke, pollution, all that would take place within the Industrial Revolution. But towards the eye of many of the viewers that it would have been seen when it was first created, around its publication in 1862, you're going to see industry, modern industry, and humans' kind of growth within this outlook of life that we see here. So, definitely two different views on how we would look into some of these ideals. So, again, chapter 9, revolutions of industrialization here. Two of the problems that we have to look at is two varying ideals in this. So let's take a look at these two quotes. One from Erik Solheim, who's a Norwegian head of the UN Environment Program. Humanity's advancement in science, technology, and industrialization is harming the planet. Hence, we need to reverse course. And another doctor, Dr. Lloyd G. Adu Amoa, who is a professor at the University of Ghana in West Africa, says we need to industrialize because if we don't, we're not adding value to what the African continent has. So two very differing views, and I think those are two views that we have to look at in a lot of different ways. Yes, industrialization does advance us in a lot of different ideals and ways. However, we look at the differences of a lot of ideals as well and how it changes. Taking a look at kind of the origins, okay? Origins of the Industrial Revolution really are going to lay within the population growth and the energy crisis. Numbers are going to, human numbers are going to increase dramatically. You have about 375 million people in 1400, okay, to about 1 billion in the early 19th century. Accompanying that growth in population was an energy crisis that we see taking place. The loss of things like wood and charcoal as major fuels, they become more scarce and much more costly as well. In addition to that, you have the global demands to push against the existing kind of local and regional ideals as we see it. In terms of energy, we're going to see much greater amounts become available. The reliance on fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas will replace a lot of those earlier energy sources of things like wind, water, and wood. And then also even the muscle and power that exists. We also see, guano being used, which is excrement from birds that is being used and being highly productive and input into a lot of different ideals. There's some significant technological advances as well. Early signs we see of this technological creativity will spawn the Industrial Revolution. One of the big ones is going to be in the textile industry. But we also understand that the steam engine, the coal-fired steam engine, can provide inanimate and almost limitless sources of power throughout this time period. And so with this, we start to see the growth within the textile industry. Okay? We'll also see kind of ideas, textile industry using that coal-fired steam engine on places like locomotives, ocean-going ships, all of the above in that area. We see chemicals, electricity, precision machinery, the telegraph, the telephone, rubber, the printing process, chemical fertilizers, things like pesticides, refrigeration that becomes a part of this. All of these things are hugely important. And so together with those new sources and new technologies, it gives rise to increases in output. All right. Output increased some 50-fold in the period of 1750 to 1900. Really, the process is unprecedented and previously unimaginable within the capacity of what human societies would have had. The first place it starts is really in Britain. It will then spread into Western Europe, mainland Western Europe, okay? And then later on into places like the United States, Russia, Japan, and really industrialization will become a global process. In the long run, there is kind of improved ideals behind conditions of life, humankind, so on and so forth. But you can't argue with the wrecking that it does on the environment, okay? There's extractions of raw materials that will eventually alter the landscape, things like coal, iron ore, petroleum. Sewers and industrial waste will become a problem. It'll empty into rivers, turning them into poisonous cesspools. At one point in time, even forcing Parliament, or excuse me, the British House of Commons to suspend their session because the Thames River was just so disgusting. You get polluted air in urban areas, and that will increase the spread of respiratory illness. And there is some voiced opposition to this. It marks a new era within human history where we start to see a more Anthropocene or age of man coming about, and more and more human industry leaving a mark on human society, but also on the ecological atmosphere that it had. Okay, this portrait here is a coal center. Coal. It shows coal being the central to the industrialization. The early process in Britain kind of involves burning coal to produce gas, and that would be used for things like lighting, public lighting. And so this image shows that process in action in a production facility located within London. This here is a map of the major industrialized spread, especially with ideas behind railroads. And you see the railroad lines there in yellow that are moving across all of Great Britain and even in the West. The iron ore fields are the axes, okay, that are existent in there. And then the red portion are the coal fields where we would draw coal from. So you could see kind of the ideals of where these things are taking place and where everything is coming from. In this portrait here, you see railroads, kind of the popularity of railroads is long a symbol of the Industrial Revolution there. This is an early 19th century watercolor that shows a miniature train offered as paid amusement for enthusiasts within London. Okay. So when we look here, we're going to talk about the first kind of industrial society, okay, within Great Britain. And I think I skipped a slide here somewhere. No, I did not. The first industrial society within Great Britain. And we're going to look at the British textile industry, which used about 52 million pounds of cotton sometime around 1800. Then we see a consummation or consuming 588 million pounds in 1850. So just a huge amount of numbers that are going up. You start to see a lot of different innovations and factory-based productions that vastly, improves the increase in output. Likewise, you see this with things like with coal being a big part of this as well. Agriculture for the millennia was overwhelmingly the dominant economic sector for most of this time, but it shrinks in relative importance. So in Britain, for example, agriculture generates only about 8% of the national income in 1891. And you have fewer than 8% of working people within Britain in 1914. Accompanying in those ideals are the prominent historian that daily life changes more than it had in 7,000 years before. There's a social transformation that takes place here as well. It both destroys and creates a new one. So Eric Hobsbawm, who was a social involved with, he's a historian, says this: in its initial stages, it destroyed their old ways of living and left them free to discover or make for themselves new ones. If they could, and knew how, but it rarely told them how to set about it. So for many people, this time period is enormously painful and even a traumatic process at times. It has social conflict, it has insecurity, false starts as well. But you also see, even though you may have those things, it could create new opportunity and eventually a higher standard of living. But you're talking about a time in which these groups are just sort of unsure of what would take place. The human gains and losses that are associated with the Industrial Revolution have been debated ever since. Not everyone is going to be affected the same way because of the Industrial Revolution. And we still have this topic of title today. So the British aristocracy. Individuals who own land were long the dominant class in British society. That is going to go by the wayside. However, let's not look at the British aristocracy, this group of landowning people, that they are going to lose out. They actually have very little material loss, and they are still celebrated as being some of the most profound members of this. But the aristocracy does decline because urban wealth kind of becomes more important. No longer is land the only factor in wealth, all right? Factories, for instance, factory owners are going to be huge portions of this. So even though there is a decline, it's not like there is a huge decline. By 1900, businessmen had really led the major political parties, and the landowning aristocracy was not necessarily a part of that. But titled nobles will retain some great social prestige and personal wealth. Many of those men will find an outlet in British colonial possessions as well, where they can build themselves up and continue to keep themselves as rather important parts. Okay, the middle class. This is the group that benefits the most from the industrialization. They is this group known as the middle class. At the upper levels of the middle class, some become extremely wealthy and bought into the aristocratic lifestyle, buying country houses, gaining seats within Parliament, sending their sons to places like Oxford or Cambridge University, accepting titles of nobility from the Queen. And so those are there. Now, a much smaller portion of this in the middle class, okay, is the large numbers of smaller businessmen and professionals. Here we're talking about doctors, lawyers, teachers, scientists within that. They set the tone for the middle class society, okay, that has its own values and outlooks. Politically, they're very liberal. They favor a constitutional government, private property, free trade, and social reform within limits. And they are the ones who are going to stand the ground on the Reform Bill of 1832, which will broaden the right to vote to many men in the middle class, but not women in the middle class. We see in a book written by, sorry, I'm ahead of myself there. Thrift and hard work and rigid morality, respectability and cleanliness characterizes that middle class culture. So the culture even changes. They have these rigid morals, and they search for these new ideals that come about. Samuel Smiles writes a book called Self-Help, in which individuals are responsible for their own destiny. He basically says an enterprising spirit was what distinguished prosperous middle class people from Britain's poor. He basically says that the poor people of Britain were only poor because it was self-imposed. They were idle. They were thriftlessness. They had thriftlessness. They just didn't really have the power to gain anything there. So that group of people, according to Samuel Smiles, is just flat out lazy, in another way to put it. Okay, this portrait here is going to be show the late 19th century painting a prosperous French middle class family who was attended by a servant. And prior to this, you would not have seen something like this take place. Let me go back here and let's talk about women, okay, and their ideals behind this. Women in middle-class families are increasingly cast as homemakers. They're wives and mothers. They are supposed to create an emotional haven for their men and a refuge from that capitalistic world. It's really, the women are supposed to create this household that is that it has respectability. They become the educators within the household there as well. Managers of the house, they go shopping, which is a new idea during this time period. And there's this ideology of domesticity, okay, which will define things like homemaking, child rearing, which means giving birth, charitable endeavors, all of those types of things. Male elites within the civilization had established their status by detaching women from productive labor. So we see within this time, families aspire to that kind of status. The husband is the provider and the woman is the lady. She does not work for profit. And employing even one servant became a very proud market or marker for the individualized groups within this. As Britain's industrial economy becomes more and more powerful, we start to see a rise in a sizable lower middle class. That's going to have people like service sector, clerks, salespeople, secretaries, those types of ideals. So by the end of the 19th century, the growing segment of the middle class represented about 20% of Britain's population. And it provides new employment opportunities for women as well. Generally speaking, those women will be single, okay? And then eventually when they do marry, they go back to the home. Female secretaries in Britain are going to rise from 7,000 to 90,000 in the years 1881 to 1901. And so you start to see the middle class is really going to become much more prominent during this time period. Now looking at the laboring class. In the 19th century, right? Sorry. Well, we're ahead of ourselves. So that is it for today, guys. We'll get into the laboring class starting tomorrow.